Good day, grade 11 learners, and welcome to this video where we will be focusing on the second topic which you will be studying for your paper 2 of your grade 11 final exam, namely plant diversity as well as reproduction. Some of the important concepts that you will need to remember when you are studying for this topic on plant diversity. Firstly, you need to know the characteristics that differentiate plant divisions. We spoke about numerous characteristics that could possibly be used to help us to differentiate between the different plant divisions that we studied. Firstly, one of the characteristics that was studied was vascular tissue. What did we look at when we spoke about vascular tissue? We spoke of the presence of the xylem and phloem. The second characteristic, we spoke about true roots, stems, and leaves. Reproductive structures, the dependence on water for fertilization. These were some of the general characteristics that we looked at that allowed us to differentiate between different plant divisions. What are the different plant divisions that I am referring to? These are the plant divisions that we studied. There were 4 plant divisions, namely Bryophyta, which was the moss plant, Pteridophyta, which was the fern plant, Gymnosperms, which was the conifers or the pine trees, Angiosperms, which was the flowering plants. Then we also looked at seed banks, and most importantly, we looked at interpreting a phylogenetic tree. Please make sure that when you are studying each of the plant divisions, Bryophyta, when you are studying the Bryophyta, you know exactly what the general characteristics are. The same goes for Pteridophyta, Gymnosperms, and Angiosperms. You need to know what the general characteristic of each plant division is. You need to know what are the characteristics that's going to differentiate one plant division from the other. What are the characteristics that's going to allow some of them to reproduce using water and some of them to reproduce using seeds? You need to be able to label the actual plant, the moss plant of the Bryophyta, label the fern plant, label the flowering plant. You need to be able to do that, and then also, most importantly, describing the process of the reproduction in Pteridophyta, describing the process of reproduction in Angiosperms as well as Gymnosperms. Please take note that the common name for Gymnosperms, the common plant, can be conifers or pine trees. This L was a spelling error. It should have read pine trees. With regards to seed banks, you need to know exactly what a seed bank is, and you'll also need to know what is the importance of a seed bank and what are seed banks going to be used for. The first question that we'll focus on will be a question 2.1. The first question that we'll focus on is a question 2.1 that reads, study the diagrams of the 2 flowers below. So you see there are 2 flowers given here. You have flower 1 as well as flower 2. 2.1.1 says name the division or taxa to which flowering plants belong for 1 mark. So the plant division to which flowering plants belong is going to be the Angiosperms. Please refrain from using the term spermatophyta. We are not going to be using the term spermatophyta, since spermatophyta refers to both Gymnosperms and Angiosperms together. If asked to give a name of a plant division, you are going to be specific. You are either going to say Gymnosperms or Angiosperms. In this case, we are looking at the flowering plant, so hence we are going to use the plant division Angiosperms. 2.1.2 says you are supplying labels for structure A. So if we look at structure A, you can see there it's a structure that's coming out of the flower. Looks like it's the male part of the flower. It's referred to as the anther, and the bottom part would have been referred to as the filament. So therefore structure A is going to be the anther. World B, if we look at world B, it's looking at this entire section here, referred to as the corolla, also known as the petal of the flower. Then structure C, if we look on the diagram, structure C is pointing to this structure on top, the first part of the female reproductive structure referred to as the stigma. Next question, 2.1.3 says you are going to give the letters of the parts of flower 2 that will drop off soon after fertilization has occurred for 2 marks. In flower 2, you are going to give the letters of the parts that will drop off soon after fertilization has occurred. So you know that fertilization is going to be that process where the male gametes is going to fuse with the female gametes to form a diploid zygote. Fertilization will most likely occur here at part D because inside the ovary you are going to have the ovule. So if you are giving the letters of the parts of flower 2 that will drop off, you will go to the first letter, part B, the petals will start falling off. Part C, the stigma starts to fall off. Part F, the anther is going to fall off. And part G, the sepal falls off. These are the letters that will start dropping off after fertilization has occurred. So the corolla or the petal, the stigma, the anther, as well as the sepal. 2.1.4, which flower, 1 or 2, is wind pollinated? Remember, wind pollinating flowers are going to be those flowers that are going to need to have large amounts of pollen, and they are going to be pollinated with the use of the wind. If we look at flower number 1, we can see that the anthers are hanging out of the flower. Since the anthers are hanging out of the flower, it's going to be a great indication that this flower is going to be wind pollinated because the anthers are hanging on the outside. 2.1.5, give 2 visible reasons for your answer in question 2.1.4. So I just mentioned now that you can see the anthers are hanging on the outsides. The stigmas here are also going to be very large. So the stigmas are large so that they can receive the pollen. The stamens are also long, so the entire male reproductive structure, it is also long. And the anthers are large to produce lots of pollen. So the anthers are very large, they're hanging on the outside, and they are very large so that they can produce large amounts of pollen. Because large amounts of pollen is going to be required to undergo the process of pollination, specifically when the type of pollination is going to be wind pollination. Name 2 unique features of flowering plants that have allowed them to become the dominant plant species on Earth. What are 2 important features that allows them to become the dominant structures? Flowering plants are different to all other plant divisions specifically because they produce flowers and they're also going to have their seeds enclosed inside a fruit. The next question, 2.4 says, study the diagram below which represents a flower. So again, we have a flower here, very similar to the previous question. We can see that the stamens are hanging out of the flower. You have a large stigma. So again, you have a great indication here that this type of flower is possibly going to be wind pollinated. 2.1.4 says define the term pollination for 2 marks. So what does pollination mean? It's the transfer of ripe pollen from the anther to the stigma. You are transferring ripe pollen from the anther to the stigma. 2.4.2, name the agent of pollination for the above flower. What is the agent of pollination in this case? It's clear that it is going to be wind. Remember, there are 3 agents of pollination. It's either wind, insects, or birds. And by looking at the flower, it can give you an indication of what the agent of pollination is. Simply because we have large stamens here and the anthers are hanging out of the flower and you have large female reproductive structures, it's an indication that this is going to be wind pollinated flowers. 2.4.3, list 3 characteristics of the flower that makes it adapted for the agent mentioned. Very, very important. You need to be able to list structural adaptations of wind pollinating flowers, bird pollinating flowers, as well as insect pollinating flowers. This question asks you to list 3 characteristics of the flower that made it adapted for the agent of pollination in question 2.4.2. What was that agent of pollination? It was wind. So we are giving the structural adaptations of wind pollinating flowers. So firstly, pollen grains are very light. They are smooth and dry to allow them to float. So pollen grains are very light. Anthers are attached to their filaments. Anthers are attached to the filaments in such a way that they are easily movable with the wind. You can see they are hanging out. Stigmas are large and feathery and sticky to trap as much pollen grains. Flowers do not have a scent and do not produce nectar. They do not have a scent and they do not produce nectar because there are no insects that's going to be attracted to them. Lastly, flowers do not have brightly colored petals. The petals are not brightly colored. Why not? Because the birds would normally be attracted to those brightly colored petals and wind would not be using brightly colored petals to their advantage. So pollen grains are light, anthers are attached to the filament in such a way that they are easily movable with the wind. Stigmas are large, flowers do not have a scent and do not have nectar, and flowers do not have brightly colored petals. Any 3 of these features would have allowed you to receive 3 marks for 2.4.3. The next question, 2.4.4 says, name one advantage of asexual reproduction in plants for 1 mark. Remember, we spoke about sexual as well as asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction was different from asexual reproduction because in sexual reproduction, that needed to occur using gametes, male gametes and female gametes, sex cells. In asexual reproduction, that was the one which only involved one parent, since it underwent the process of binary fission. So one advantage of asexual reproduction over sexual reproduction could firstly be that a large number of offspring are rapidly produced. So you can produce a large number of offspring over a very short period of time. Why? Because you only need one parent. You don't need more than one parent. Secondly, your offspring are going to be genetically identical. Why? One parent is involved. So therefore, the child is going to look exactly like that same parent. If the parent is well adapted to the environment, then the new plant will also be well adapted. So for example, if the parent has certain characteristics where it's well adapted to the environment, then it goes without saying that the new plant will also be well adapted because there weren't 2 parents involved. It was only one parent involved. Also, new plants are produced relatively quickly because you only need one parent, so it won't take very long for new plants to be reproduced. Agents of pollination and seed dispersal are not required, so that's also something that can be an advantage. So if you had any of these correct for 2.4.4, any one advantage would have given you 1 mark. 2.4.5 says explain why seedless vascular plants. What are the seedless vascular plants? Vascular plants started with the pteridophyta. The pteridophyta are seedless. The only plants that are vascular, that have seeds, are going to be gymnosperms and angiosperms. So they're speaking about the pteridophyta. Explain why seedless vascular plants are able to grow taller than non-vascular plants. What do the pteridophytes have that the bryophyta does not have? The pteridophyta has conducting tissues, so since it's vascular, it comprises of the xylem and phloem, very importantly. And the plants are able to transport water and minerals to greater heights. Why? Because they're going to have true roots, stems, and leaves. 2.4.6 describe one adaptation of angiosperms that makes them survive on land. What is one thing that angiosperms has that allows them to survive on land? The leaves has a cuticle. Angiosperms have true root, stems, and leaves. The embryo is enclosed in a seed to prevent it from drying out. So after reproduction has occurred, the embryo gets enclosed in a seed. It also has conducting tissues such as the xylem and phloem, very psimilar to what the pteridophyte had. So any two of these points to describe one adaptation, you just have to describe one of the adaptations and you would have gotten 2 marks for 2.4.6. The next question is taken from a 2.1, which reads, the diagrams below show the parts of plants representing the different groups or divisions that you have studied. So diagram A, diagram B, and diagram C. You notice that each diagram has their own magnification. Each diagram has their own magnification. And obviously the reason as to why that would be the case is some of the plants are generally smaller than others. The moss plant being the smallest plant division that we have studied. 2.1.1 says provide labels for numbers 1, 2, 3 and 4. There is 4 marks, 1 mark per correct label because there's 4 different labels. So firstly we go to number 1. This is going to be referred to as the frond. Number 2 is referred to as the rhizome. Number 3 is going to be referred to as the leaf. And number 4, the root-like structures in the moss plant is referred to as the rhizoid. 2.1.2, name the plant that is wind pollinated for 1 mark. Out of these 3 plants given to you here, which plant is generally wind pollinated? The type of plant that is generally wind pollinated is going to be diagram A, which is going to be the pine tree. 2.1.3, which part A, B or C is the largest for 1 mark? Now you need to remember that the magnification is what we can focus on here. The bigger magnification means that it is going to be the smallest plant. And the smaller magnification means it's going to be the biggest plant. So the biggest magnification here is 20. And the smallest magnification is 0,2. They want the largest plant. Therefore, we are going to select diagram A as the largest plant. The next question, 2.1.4 says name the group of plants to which A belongs. So the group to which A belongs, it's 2 marks of both, so it's 1 mark each. The name of the group is going to be the gymnosperms because we can see that here is a cone here. To which B belongs, so we look at B, what is the name of this plant group? It's going to be the pteridophyta because we can see we have a fern. 2.1.5 state one way in which the seeds of group A plants are adapted for dispersal. One way in which the seeds of group A plant is adapted for dispersal. What do the seeds do here that allows them to be dispersed? So they are going to have wings. So the seeds are generally going to have wings, and it's going to allow the wind to actually attach themselves onto those wings and then transfer the seeds from one cone to another. 2.1.6 identify whether A, B or C represents a gametophyte generation. A, B or C. Now you need to ask yourself, in which plant division is the gametophyte generation dominant? The gametophyte generation is dominant only in the bryophyta, only in the moss plant. Therefore, the answer is going to be diagram C. All other plant divisions, the gymnosperms, the pteridophytes, as well as the angiosperms, their dominant generation is the sporophyte generation. 2.1.7 explain how the dependency on water for reproduction is reduced in group A plants for 2 marks. In group A, how is the dependency on water for reproduction reduced? So firstly and most importantly, the pollen grains carry male gametes to the ovule, and wind is going to be the agent that takes the pollen from the male cone to the female cone. So pollen grains get transferred from the male cone to the female cone with the use of wind, and it does not need water in order to do that process. That is how the dependency on water for reproduction is reduced in group A plants. 2.1.8 explain the significance of the shape of the leaves in diagram A to its habitat for 3 marks. What is the significance of these leaves that you have on a pine tree? So firstly, the leaves are going to be thin leaves, not needle shaped, which reduces the surface area. It's also going to have a sunken stomata, and that sunken stomata is going to reduce the transpiration in hot, dry habitats. So any 3 of these points would have given you 3 marks for explaining the significance of the shape of the leaves. This is something that's very important. You need to remember this as well. Remember that term transpiration refers to the loss of water from the leaves of a plant. That brings us to the end of the section where we revised biodiversity in plants as well as reproduction. Therefore, thus far, we have touched on biodiversity and the classification of microorganisms, and now we have completed biodiversity in plants and reproduction, focusing on section B questions from previous question papers. The next video will focus on biodiversity in animals. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope to have you all join me in the next video. We will focus on biodiversity of animals.